Hello everybody, it's Kevin here again, and this week we're going to be covering the week 5 items. So we're going to cover columns, the ternary operator. Ternary operator we've already kind of gone over in week 2, but we're going to cover it with how it can be applied in the UI. And progress indicators, we use those a little bit more. It's going to be a pretty straightforward application. This is what the final product's going to look like. So we're going to go and pull some stuff from a database. We're not actually going to make an API call or fetch anything from a database in this lecture, but it's going to mimic what it would be like. So what an asynchronous call would look like in Flutter, basically. So we click this button. Once we click the button, we're loading some stuff from the database, so we're informing the user that they got to wait. And we're going to show some of the stuff that's quote-unquote in the database. That's what we're trying to mimic. So to start, of course, we want to create a new project. One Flutter projects here. And I'll just do it this way. Now that that's created, we're going to go into the week 5 lecture folder, open this with code, and we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping here, so we're going to get rid of all these items. And why don't we go ahead and launch this, just so we can get that boilerplate, the first app, that logic up here to the device. And I'm going to go ahead and pause and come back once it's uploaded. So here we are. The application is uploaded onto the device. So this is all functional. First thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to get rid of this floating action button because we're not going to need it. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. Save it. Now that's gone. We're not going to need this here function. And we're not going to need counter. So now that those items are eliminated, let's get rid of these widget items as well. So right away, right off the bat, what do we want to do? We want to let the user know what the application title is. So let's just call this the week 5 demo, week 5 lecture actually. We're good to go. I'm going to go ahead and leave that color that it selected, that it came up with right away when I created the application. Then of course we need our scaffold and the app bar, so those items will stay, but our center we're going to want to get rid of, or not the center, the column. So in here we're going to want to have some logic right away. So we want to have two different scenarios, let's call it that. Basically the first scenario is if the page is first loaded. So the customer first came into the page and say they're going to log in. So we're going to have to separate that logic. Now depending on the programming language and on the framework that you were working with, it might be handled a little differently. So for example, you might have them hit the button. They might hit one button. That button might fire off some logic and send them off to another page. Or you could have some conditional logic in there as well, so that the UI for this initial page, the main.dart page, that UI will handle both of those instances, and that's how we're going to handle it now, for now at least. So first we're going to want to have a Boolean. So we're going to go ahead and define a Boolean over here. is page first load, or let's actually call it just page first load. We're going to initialize that to true. And now that that's done, we're going to go and start working with our logic here. So inside of our center, we want to go and say, let's see here, just looking at some logic over here on this side. Right away, we want to say, hey, is the page first load, right? Is that true? Is it the first time that the page is loaded? So if that's the case, we're going to go ahead and get rid of all this stuff here. So if that's the case, we're going to go and have an elevated button. And on press is going to be null for now. The child is going to be a text widget. And I apologize if I'm typing a little slower than usual. I had an injury here with my thumb, and I'm in a cast. So it's going to take a little bit longer. Please bear with me. Oh, whoops. There you go. One of these might not be necessary, actually. So we're just going to say load items for database here. And just lowercase, actually. Save that, and we need the other condition. So if that's the case, if it's the page first load, we're going to display this elevated button. If not, we're going to do that. We're going to say display text widget. Say not page first load. Save that. And since it's a null, it's actually not going to do anything. So why don't we handle that method now? So we're going to have a void handle button press. It's not going to take in anything. We're going to set our state in there. Perfect. And we're going to execute handle button press in here. And inside of our set state, why don't we set is page first load, or page first load, to false? Save that, click it. Alright, not the page first load. And if we set a breakpoint in here, we'll notice, let's go ahead and restart the application now, kind of just to go through that logic that's firing off. I want to make sure it's going to hit that breakpoint. Okay, perfect. So at this point, page first load is true, and the UI is responding adequately, because if that is true, we're going to have that elevated button. The second we assign a new value to it, we're going to set the state. So right now it's false. We need to update the state, continue, and now the other block is being handled right here. It's not the page first load. So it's that straightforward. That's really all there is to the ternary operator inside the UI. It's pretty straightforward. So this is not what we want to do, though. We don't want to just let the user know that it's not the first page load. So what we want to do is we want to mimic a database or an API call, right? So we're going to have another Boolean here, is loading items from a database. And we're going to initialize that to false. So now we're going to have a little bit more logic. So let's think about it. If it's the first page load, we want to show them the button. If it's not the first page load, which means that they've hit the button at this point, at least according to our logic so far, we want to display a loading message, basically, but we want to check the value of whether or not it's loading the items from the database. So we're going to check the value of this variable here. So what we're going to do is we can actually nest it. It's like nested if statements. So again, we're going to check is loading. So if it's the page first load, we're going to do this. Else, it's going to be like, we're going to do another logic statement. So else, we're going to check to see the value of is loading items from database. If that's true, Then we're going to display the circular progress indicator. But actually, we're not going to want to do that right away, because we're going to want to have multiple items in there. So we're going to want to have some sort of widget to handle displaying multiple items on screen. And what comes to mind right away? Well, it's the column. So we're going to display a column. This column, we're going to have the main axis alignment. We're going to have that set to the center. Whoops. Perfect. And we're going to set this to const to get rid of that message. And now we want to handle the other scenario. So, I'm sorry. Let's see here. We want to put the more stuff in here. I'm sorry. So, we're going to want to have the children assigned in there. So, children is going to be of type widget. And I see that this is kind of getting in the way here. We're going to save to format. And actually, it's not going to auto format because there technically is a syntax error. So let's just throw another let's throw a placeholder here so we can get this to save and auto format. So if that's the case, we're going to display this column. Else, we're going to display a text widget with a message of items loaded. Probably can't see it from here, but there we go. Add our trailing commas for formatting purposes. Now that that's done, let's look at our logic again. So if it's the page first load, we're going to display this button, which, remember, page first load is initialized to true. So we're going to display that button. And once that button is hit, we're going to go to handle button press. So we're going to set page first load to false. So we're going to handle right away after they hit that button, we're going to go into this other condition. We're going to check to see if items are being loaded from the database, which is initialized to false. The value of that variable is false. So because of that, we should see items loaded right away. But if that was true, if we were loading items from the database, we would see this column with some stuff in it. And why don't we just put something in there real quick? So let's set that circular progress indicator in there. Whoops, not circle avatar. And that's just going to be displayed. And then after that, we're going to have a text widget saying, please wait. We're going to save that, and why don't we go ahead and restart here. We're going to select the button, click on here. I didn't get rid of that breakpoint, and boom, we completely skipped this block. Why? Because we never did anything with is loading items from database. So here's where some of the other logic comes into play. So how does this API call work, right? We're not going to get super into the weeds of that. We're actually going to cover that extensively in a few weeks here, because that in itself is a whole nother block of software development. So your APIs and grabbing stuff from a database and proper conventions with those operations that should be followed. That's a lot more wide, right? That's a lot more. It's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of material. So we're not going to cover that in this lecture. But we will do is we will mimic that call. So to mimic that call, we need to go and we need to wait, right? So typically when you go and make an API call, that API call is going to get you some data. So far with a lot of the applications that you all have built, you define the data in memory, right? So you're going to have a class as an object model, and that object model will represent, say, a customer, a user, a transaction, so on and so forth. And really, if you think about it, that represents a table, right? So say you have a table customer table, and this customer table has a couple of columns, right? So you have the customer name, the customer address, the customer zip code, the customer, all kinds of customer information. Well, that table can be represented in code. Now, if you instead of having the columns being on the top, right? So first, second, third, fourth, fifth property, you have it sideways where each one of those properties is instead a variable. That's how you can represent that table in code. So that way you can have that type, right? That's how we refer to it, as a type. It's a type that you define, but nonetheless, it's still a type. That's how you would set it in code. So once you go and you have all these structures set in place to be able to access the properties of this new type, you need to be able to fetch it. So that's what the API call is for typically. So that API call, application programming interface, is a call to a server, typically an endpoint. So think of like www.google.com. When you go, and if you do like, let's go to bash here. Whoops. If we do curl www.google.com, that's going to return all this stuff, right? But what is this stuff? This is the response payload. This is what when we went to go make this API call, right? Technically, right? Curl, we're going to go make the API call to this endpoint, google.com. It's going to return all this stuff. So if you take all this HTML and you paste it into an HTML document, the result is going to be, let's see here. Well, it'd just be a web page. I guess that's how simple it is. It'd just be the web page, so it'd be google.com. So when you go and you make an API call to get some stuff from a server, right? In this case, you might be getting customer information from a server for a certain customer ID. You have to wait for that information to come back because it's not instantaneous. So when you read from memory, when you read from something that's defined in your class, or it's defined within the scope of the method that's accessing those resources, that's just a memory access, right? So you're accessing something that's already in memory. So that's almost instantaneous. It's rapid. So there's no waiting. The second you go and display those items on screen, it's just going to go and check, hey, memory location 0x, blah, 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 fetch whatever's there, right? Go through the, if you were working with C#, it'd be the common language runtime, right? The CLR. And or with Java, it'd be the JVM. Go through that intermediary, and then at the high level, give us access to that stuff that's in memory, right? If you're working with C++, you'd have a little bit more direct access, and if you were working with C or with assembly, it'd be direct memory access. So I guess what I'm getting at is it's rapid. We don't have to wait on it. However, with this, when we want to mimic that waiting, because the server's not going to be instantaneous. When you go to www.google.com, it's not going to be. You can have gigabit internet and it doesn't matter. There's going to be some period of waiting, whether it's 1 millisecond or 1,000 milliseconds. There's going to be some duration that they're going to have to wait. So to mimic that, we're just going to do. I understand that I went off on a tangent here, but it'll start making sense here. We're going to mimic that by having what's known as a lambda, right? So that's covered in Java and in C#. A lambda, where you have like in JavaScript, it might be referred to as like an anonymous function. But basically, it's something that gets executed at that instant. It's not a defined method. So in this case, we'd go future, because that's the structure that handles, if you look over it, that's the structure that's used for asynchronous operations in Flutter. So we'd go future.delayed, and we're going to pass in a duration object, and it'll actually tell you here, again, the tooling is quite nice. Duration, and it's going to it makes it again really straightforward. So we're just going to have seconds here, and we're just going to wait for, let's say, 5 seconds, right? So 5 seconds, and what we're going to do here is we're going to have our lambda. It's not going to have any parameters. So what can we do in here? Well, we can go and we can set our variable. We can change the value of a variable. So what can we modify? Well, we can modify our is loading items from database. The problem is that if you think about the way that Flutter works, is if you change the value of a variable, the value is not directly bound to the UI. Even though this is a stateful widget, it's still not directly bound to the UI. What that means, in layman's terms, is if you update the value of a variable, it's not going to show up in the UI. You have to set the state. So there's no exception here. Once we get to this point, so let's kind of fly through the execution here. We're going to go and execute this method, handle button press. We're going to set the state immediately, and we're going to set the value of page first load to false. After that, we're going to fire this off, this future. So it'll be synchronous still. Up to this point, it'll go, if you think of like an instruction pointer, like with assembly, it'd be pointing here to this instruction. It'd go and do this logic, move over to here, fire this off, and then this will, I guess it's kind of hard to translate this into assembly because it's such a high level structure, but just to kind of dumb it down, if you will, it'll hit this logic and it'll move on to the next next block of logic. However, once this fires off, think about it as like a cannon fuse. You set that cannon fuse off, and we're waiting for that fuse to burn down. In this case, we set that burn down rate of we set the burn down period to 5 seconds. Once that happens, let's think of what happens once you finish that cannon fuse. It'll fire off the cannonball. So the cannonball in here in this case would be the changing of the variable. So is loading items from database is going to be set to false. So if we think about this though, this really won't do anything at this point, because the value of is loading items from database is false. So that doesn't change. We're still going to jump straight to this block. So what we need to do is we need to set, once they click the button, we need to say, hey, we're loading items from the database. So we need to set that flag. So is loading items from database is equal to true. And let's see here. Once we do that, why don't we restart? And we'll set a couple breakpoints here to kind of flow through the logic and see what exactly it's doing. So we loaded our stuff, all of the all the changes. So it did compile, restarted the application. So we're going to select this button right here. We're going to hit this breakpoint right away. We're going to update these values. And then, now that those values are updated, we're going to fire off this duration. So I'm just going to go and step ahead. And it's going to be 5 seconds. Once those 5 seconds are up, we should hit this breakpoint right here. Now remember, why is it loading items from database? Because we set that to true right away. So since we set that to true, our logic on the UI is gonna update instantaneously. So remember, if it's the page first load, we're gonna display that elevated button. Once they hit it, we're gonna go into method or function handle button press, which will set page first load to false, which means that this button will no longer be visible. And is loading items from database will be set to true. Since this is no longer visible because this block is no longer true, this condition is no longer true, we're going to check the value of is loading items from database. Since the value of is loading items from database is true, we're going to display the column, and inside of that column we're going to have a circular progress indicator, and we're going to have text saying please wait. Once that's done, once we get to this point, which we have, 5 seconds have passed, we set the value of is loading items from database to false, and we tell the user, hey, items are loaded. So let's go ahead and step ahead here. Let it get its thing done there. Alright, why don't we restart? Let's make sure it wasn't a debugging thing. Five seconds. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and stop this just to review the code, make sure that everything looks good. Okay, so it's quite straightforward. Let's think about why this might not be working. So let's go through the troubleshooting methods here, the troubleshooting path, I guess, whatever you want to call it. We go and we load our items from the database. We have this function that's going to execute. This here block is going to execute asynchronously, so after 5 seconds. We update the value of this variable, but hey, it doesn't update the UI. Why is that? Makes perfect sense. We don't set the state again. We always need to set the state. So that's all that was missing. So we go ahead and get rid of this, set the state, paste this block inside of there, get rid of that breakpoint, and we'll display that stuff. So we'll go ahead and update we'll do a hot restart. Load our items from the database. 5 seconds are going to pass. Value is going to be set to false. And there we go. Our items have been loaded. So it's a minor thing, but it happens. So once we load our items from the database, what do we want to display? Obviously the items from the database. So how can we do that? We're going to want to use what's known as a single child scroll view. So if you look into the documentation, what it does is it allows you to scroll through items on the screen. If you go and you use a widget that doesn't allow you to scroll, what's going to end up happening is you're going to display more items on screen if you have more items on screen, and you don't know, right? If you're making an API call or call to a database, you're probably not going to know how much stuff is in that table. So you're probably going to go ahead and overflow. And it's not because you want to, it's because that's what that UI element's going to allow you to do. It's only going to allow you to display the items that can fit inside of the screen real estate. So to allow for scrolling, to allow the user to scroll, we have to use a single child scroll view. So instead of this text widget, we're going to have a single child scroll view. And inside of this single child scroll view, as the name suggests, it's got a single child. So we're going to want to have some sort of widget that can display an array of widgets. So we're going to set our child property here to a column. And into this column, we're just going to set let's set our cross-axis alignment so that we can have it all aligned nicely on the screen. Okay, and we're going to want to set our children here. Let's see here. For now, let's just display a text widget. Whoops. And there's our stuff. So it's going to set it's going to give you that const warning because there's no statefulness. Basically, it detects that there's no statefulness inside of this block. So it's going to tell you, hey, set this to const. But it will be stateful here. It will update the stuff inside of it later on. So we're not going to worry about that message. So far we have this single child scroll view, and this isn't actually going to do anything until we add more items. So what if we have one text widget? Well, that's not going to be really an issue because we have the screen real estate for one text widget. What if we have two text widgets? Well, then we're going to have two items. What if we have several, right? Let's display a bunch here. Okay, well now that's where the utility comes into play, right? So now we can scroll through it. It's a pretty useful structure there. But this isn't, whoops, that's not what we want to do. We want to display some items on screen. So we need to mimic the stuff inside of that database. So what we're going to have to do right away is we're going to have to create a class. So for this class, we're going to call it item, just to keep it as generic as possible. Again, this could be customer, this could be card number or card information. It could be let's see here, of course, item, something that that a retail location stores and that they're going to sell. It could be medications for a pharmacy. It could be anything, right? So in this case, it'll be an item. This item's going to have a string name. For now, we're not really going to worry about normalization, right? So if this was a database table, yeah, we want first name and last name, and we want to kind of break it apart as much as we can and have separate entities, but we're not going to worry about that for now. For now, we're just demonstrating the a database table inside of the UI, if you will. So we're going to have our name, we're going to have our ID, price, and stock keeping unit. So a string. We're going to want to have a constructor. And not that the order really matters, but I'll just do it in this order. So that works. And now we're going to want to create some items to represent those values inside of the database. So in here, we're going to create a list of type item. And I'm just going to call it items. We're going to set that equal to new items, right? So item, and I'll demonstrate it here. I'll just type it all out so that you can follow along with your own example, with your own use case for the assignment. But I will copy all the other ones so you don't have to sit there and watch me type all the item names. So for example, the first item is going to be, again, think about the constructor that we created. That's the purpose of it, of course, right? We're going to fill the values inside of that class. So the first thing is going to be the name, then the ID, then the price, and the stock keeping unit, just as we defined. So for the name, it's going to have canned soup. Oops. And then we need a price. I'm sorry, an ID 101. Then a price, $2.99. And then the stock keeping unit, so SKU 001. Whoops, that's going to be a comma. So that's what that would look like. Instead of typing them all out, like I said, I will just paste all these other ones in here. So we want to display all these items on screen. So how can we do that? Well, let's just go in this nice little single child scroll view structure, and within it, of course, the column. And we're going to use that map functionality again that we used before. So the children aren't going to be, it's not going to have of type widget, right? The children, at least not immediately. What we're going to do is we're going to map all this stuff. So I'm going to get rid of all this. And we're going to say it's going to be kind of like a for each, right? Because with a for each, you have an iterable list. And inside of that for each block, you're going to be executing that logic for each item in that list, in that iterable. So what we're going to do is we're just going to map the items, items.map. And we're going to have kind of like with that for each. So for a, right, so for variable, my variable in my list, right, the my variable is going to be the instance, right, the element that we're iterating through. So one at a time. So we're just going to call this item. And we're going to do this. There we go. I hope that, all right, IntelliSense isn't going to be too happy right away, but that's not a big deal. In here, we're going to have padding. All right, why is this not happy? I'll just clean it up for now, just so that we can have stuff showing up on screen right away. Okay, so the problem here is we need to convert this to a list. So I'm going to do .toList. That's all we should have to do there. That padding, get rid of, well, it's going to want something in there. So we're going to return inside of their padding, because we're going to want some padding between each item. Inside of this padding, we're going to set our padding. It's going to be set to 8 pixels. Set that to a double. Then we're going to have our child. This child's going to be a column. We're going to set our alignment. Oops, not the children quite yet. Set that to the beginning. Then we're going to set our children. And why don't we set this? There we go. That's what that wanted. Okay. In here, we're going to want some text widgets. So text widget. The first one's going to be item.name. And we're not going to set any styles right away. We will eventually, but not right away. Okay. Just wanted a comma. So I know that this looks a little confusing. Oh, isn't that beautiful? That's not at all what we want. I'm just right clicking, by the way. There we go. So what are we doing right away? So let's kind of go through the UI again. What we do is, what we did here is we have this single child scroll view. We don't have enough items to scroll, but inside of this single child scroll view, which we can think of it as like a container type widget that we can scroll, it implements all that wonderful geometry logic that we would want for scrolling, and it makes it quite simple to use. Inside of that, we're going to have a column, and that column is going to set where in the screen. It's just to organize it and for formatting purposes. We're going to set the alignment, and the children is going to be the stuff, right? So for each one of these items, we're going to have this stuff going on, right? So what is this stuff? It's the padding of 8 pixels all around it, and a column with some stuff in it. For now, the stuff is just the item name. So what if we add more stuff? Well, that's not a problem because we're inside of a widget that can contain multiple items. So we're going to do another text widget, and in here we're going to do a little bit of formatting. So, whoops, not key, price. And we want to escape because we can't just display a $sign. So this is how we escape to display the special, basically special character. And we want to display what the item is. Or we want to do a little bit of string interpolation. So item.price, whoops, .toString is fixed. Now there's multiple ways to handle this, but this is a pretty clean way of handling formatting of a double. Just the toString is fixed, and that's going to take in 2 for 2 decimal points. Add a comma for formatting, save, and we should see our price as well. So there's our item name and our item price. Next, we want to display the stock keeping unit. So another text widget. A little bit more string, a little bit more of string interpolation. Add a comma just for formatting purposes. And, well, that looks not the best, right? But it looks alright. We're getting our stuff out to the screen. It would be quite nice, though, to have this text be a little bit bigger, to know that this is the beginning of the new item. Because as of right now, it's just a bunch of stuff. So why don't we handle that? Inside of our first text widget, we're going to set a new style. This style is going to be just a text style widget. This text style widget is going to have it's going to set the font size to 20 pixels, 20 point. All right, that looks pretty good so far. However, it's still kind of difficult to see the difference between each item. So what we can do is we can set a divider. And there we go. By setting that divider, we can see the difference between each item. So we have our name, we have our price, we have our stock keeping unit right here, and we could do the ID as well. I mean, we might as well, right? So we could go ahead and do here oops, there we go. And we're going to do a toString here, just so that it displays it. But that looks kind of, it doesn't keep up with these other ones. It doesn't look like the other ones, right? We have a description. 102, what is 102? So we got to let the user know that it's the ID. And let's just do some string interpolation here again. Beautiful. So, I mean, really, that's about it. That's what the app does. We display some items from the database. So why don't we go ahead and restart the application. So again, let's kind of go through the logic here. It was a pretty quick app. It wasn't super complicated, but we did cover some super important items. So let's go through the logic again. We want to display this button right here. So when is the button displayed? It's displayed when page first load is set to true. So the center is always going to be present. This widget is always going to be displayed on screen, and we're always going to reserve the UI space for this widget. The child of it is set to a conditional. page first load. Page first load is initialized to true. So right away when we go into this, when this logic starts to fire off, page first load will be true. So in turn, the page will reflect that the value of that variable. So page first load is set to true, so we're displaying the elevated button. Once that elevated button is pressed, we go into method or function handle button press. Inside of handle button press, we have a set state. What the set state will do is it will update the items on the screen. And what all we're doing here is we're just setting the flags to we're setting different values for the flags. So page first load is no longer true; it's false. And is loading items from database is going to be set to true. So let's go back to the logic. Since this is false, this is no longer going to be displayed. So we're going to move on to the next block to display, but it's not going to be something that we're going to display. We're going to check the value of another variable as loading items from database. So once we check the value of that, if it's true, we're going to say, hey, please wait, basically. So we're going to display that circular progress indicator. We're going to say, please wait. Once the value is false, we're going to display the actual stuff that's in quote-unquote the database, which we defined up here. And once they hit the button, we're going to update the values again, like I said, and we're going to fire off this asynchronous logic. Once this stuff goes off, once this asynchronous logic is done, once we get into the block where it's completed, we're going to set the state again so we can update the values of the screen again. And we're going to set is loading items from database to false and display this other stuff. So if we click on here, it should wait for 5 seconds. Once that's done, we should be able to see all of our items from quote-unquote the database. Again, like I said, this is not exactly, well, I don't know if I already said it, but this is not exactly how the API call would be done. So you'd still use a future, and once this stuff is done, once you get the data from the API call, you would still set your state, so on and so forth, but you're not going to be setting stuff, you're not going to be using stuff in memory. You will probably be assigning the values of what came back from the API to a variable in memory, and you're gonna reference that variable, like for example items. You're gonna reference that, so that's still gonna be true. But the actual data itself won't be defined in code. It'll be coming from the database or from the API. So that just about sums it up. It's pretty straightforward, but it's pretty powerful logic that you can execute with this ternary operator. So thanks for watching. Let me know if there's any questions.